The fire crackled in the library hearth, casting shadows that danced across walls lined with engineering text and territorial maps. Thomas Hayes sat in his leather chair, hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey that had gone warm in his grip. At 67, his fingers trembled slightly, not from age but from the weight of memory. Across from him, Daniel Morrison adjusted his position on the settee notebook, open pencil poised. The young reporter from Harper's Weekly had traveled 200 miles to Miles City with one purpose: to chronicle the great engineers who built the American West. He'd expected tales of railroad trestles and irrigation systems of conquest over wilderness through superior intellect and modern technique. What he was about to receive was something entirely different. "Mr. Hayes," Morrison began, his voice carrying that peculiar blend of respect and impatience common to ambitious young men. "Your reputation precedes you. Union fortifications from Virginia to Tennessee during the war. The Hayes wheat farm with its revolutionary design. Your published work on thermal efficiency and frontier construction. I'm here to document your achievements for our readers back east." Thomas took a slow sip of whiskey, then set the glass down with deliberate care. When he spoke, his voice carried the rough edges of a man who'd spent decades fighting Montana wind. "You want to hear about a great engineer? Then I'll tell you about one, but not the one you came expecting." Morrison's pencil hovered over blank paper. November of 1873. Thomas continued, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I was the best engineer within 200 miles. At least I thought I was. I'd built fortifications for the Union that withstood Confederate artillery. I understood gravity, materials, thermodynamics. Or at least I thought I understood." "What changed your mind?" Thomas looked directly at the young reporter, and Morrison saw something unexpected in those weathered eyes. Not pride, but something closer to shame, tempered by years into acceptance. "A Polish woman with a borrowed pickaxe and 47 silver dollars proved that my 25 years of education weren't worth the childhood memories of her grandmother." Morrison's pencil began to move across the page. "But before she saved 5 lives in the worst blizzard of the century," Thomas said, his voice dropping lower, "I tried to stop her. That was the biggest mistake of my life." The log in the fireplace split with a sharp crack, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. Thomas poured himself another measure of whiskey, then settled deeper into his chair. When he began again, his voice had changed, falling into the cadence of a man no longer in a Montana library in 1898, but standing instead on frozen ground beside Rosebud Creek, 25 years younger and infinitely more certain of everything he thought he knew. November 17th, 1873. The Montana Territory sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the promise of winter. Thomas Hayes rode his gelding along the creek bed, ostensibly checking water levels for spring irrigation, but truthfully seeking any excuse to escape the emptiness of his farmhouse. At 42, Thomas had already buried more of life than most men his age. Catherine had died 2 years prior, taking their unborn child with her into whatever darkness waited beyond the veil. He'd rebuilt his cabin 3 times since then, each iteration an attempt to construct something that might have kept them alive, though he knew in his heart that no amount of engineering could resurrect the dead. The limestone cliff face rose 63 feet above the creek, its layers telling stories older than human memory. Thomas had ridden past it 100 times without particular notice. But on this day, something drew his attention. Movement against the pale stone, the rhythmic sound of metal striking rock. He pulled his horse up short. A woman stood at the base of the cliff's natural alcove, swinging a pickaxe with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done hard labor before. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, wearing a dress that had seen better seasons and an apron stained with limestone dust. Her hair, dark and streaked with premature gray, was pulled back in a severe bun. But it was what she was building that made Thomas dismount and approach on foot. A retaining wall, dry stacked stone, no mortar. Just rocks fitted together with such precision that he couldn't have slid a knife blade between them. "Ma'am," Thomas called out, removing his hat with the practiced courtesy that couldn't quite hide his confusion. "What are you building here?" The woman didn't stop working. When she spoke, her English carried the thick consonants of Eastern Europe, each word deliberate and carefully chosen. "A home. Stone holds heat better than pine, stays cool in summer, warm in winter, and it will not burn." Thomas studied the excavation she'd already completed, 2 feet deep into the alcove's floor, a level platform extending 6 feet into the natural shelter. She'd been at this maybe 72 hours and had already created the foundation for something he couldn't quite comprehend. You plan to winter in a cave. He didn't say it cruel, but the skepticism ran deep as a well shaft. The woman straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. She met his eyes with a directness that unsettled him. Women on the frontier learned quickly to lower their gaze around men they didn't know. This one didn't. Mr. Brennan, she said, though he hadn't introduced himself. Small communities had no secrets. You build with what God provides. He provided this. She gestured to the overhang. 16 feet deep, already south-facing so winter sun reaches inside. The rock is soft enough to carve hard enough to last, and it costs me nothing but sweat. Thomas's engineering mind engaged despite his skepticism. She wasn't wrong about the orientation. That alcove would catch every available ray of winter sunlight. The overhang protected it from rain and snow. The creek sat just 200 yards down the slope for water. But winter in Montana Territory wasn't a matter of geography. It was a matter of survival, measured in cordwood and calories. And this woman had neither. Ma'am, with respect, I've built in 7 states and 3 territories. Stone walls without mortar won't hold heat. You'll freeze to death by January and we'll find you come spring thaw. He said it gentle, the way a man delivers bad news to someone who hasn't accepted reality yet. My wife and I, we've got room in the barn. It's not much, but it's warmer than... I worked 2 seasons in the Chicago stockyards. The woman interrupted, her voice carrying no anger, just the flat certainty of someone who'd already calculated the odds. 14-hour days in the cold rooms where they hung the beef. Stone walls 3 feet thick. Inside it stayed 42 degrees all winter, even when the air outside dropped to 0. The men who built those rooms, they were Irish. They learned it from their fathers who learned it in the old country. Thermal mass, they called it. The thick stone absorbs heat during the day, releases it at night. Stays warmer than wood burns less fuel. She picked up the pickaxe again, turning back to her excavation. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Hayes, but I'll be fine. Thomas mounted his horse, shaking his head. He was convinced he'd be helping dig her grave before Christmas. That night, over a solitary dinner in his too large cabin, Thomas tried to dismiss the encounter. But the woman's words lingered. Thermal mass. He'd read about the principle in engineering texts. The concept was sound. Stone did absorb and release heat more efficiently than wood. But seeing it applied in practice, especially by a woman in the wilderness, challenged everything he thought he knew about frontier construction. And that challenge felt personal in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Why does this trouble you? He asked himself aloud, his voice echoing in the empty cabin. The answer, when it came, tasted like ashes. Because if she was right, then he might have been wrong. And if he was wrong about thermal mass, then perhaps he'd been wrong about the cabin where Catherine died. Perhaps with different knowledge, with more humility, with less arrogant certainty in his own expertise, he might have built something that kept her warm enough to survive the winter that took her life. Thomas poured whiskey and tried to drown the thought. It refused to sink. 10 days passed. Thomas told himself he was riding past the limestone cliff to check on fence posts. He told himself his route just happened to take him near Rosebud Creek. He told himself he wasn't specifically seeking out the Polish woman who was probably already dead from exposure and stubbornness. All lies felt more comfortable than the truth he needed to know if she was right. What he found shocked him to his bones. The excavation had progressed dramatically. The woman had carved 8 feet deeper into the limestone, creating a space roughly 24 feet deep and 12 feet wide. The natural ceiling rose 11 feet at the entrance, sloping to 7 feet at the back. The retaining wall at the front stood solid and plumb, each stone locked with its neighbors through nothing but weight and friction. No mortar, no nails, just ancient technique and absolute precision. But it was what she was building in the corner that stopped Thomas cold. Something that looked like a beehive made of clay and stone. Roughly 6 feet tall, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, at the base tapering to a narrow top. Internal channels he could see through gaps in the construction. A firebox at ground level. What appeared to be a complex maze of passages leading upward. What is that? He asked without greeting. The woman looked up from her work, unsurprised by his presence. She was mixing clay from the creek bed with dried grass, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Masonry heater, Russian design. My grandmother had one in the old country. Thomas dismounted, circling the structure with an engineer's critical eye. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each stone carefully chosen for size and shape, the internal channels designed to maximize surface area for heat transfer, the firebox positioned to create optimal draft. You're building a Russian stove from memory, without blueprints, without measurements. I was 12 years old when my grandmother built two of them. I mixed the clay and handed her bricks. I remember the proportions, the shapes, the way smoke travels through the channels inside. She didn't look up from her work. My grandmother said a woman who can build her own warmth never has to beg for it. Thomas felt something crack open inside his chest. Not desire, though the woman was handsome in a severe way. Not pity, though her circumstances would have warranted it. Something closer to recognition, or perhaps revelation. And you think this will work? Now she did look up, met his eyes with that same unsettling directness. I know it will work. My grandmother heated an entire house, 6 rooms with 1 stove and 2 fires a day. This technique has existed for thousands of years, Mr. Hayes. It doesn't need your approval to function. Thomas rode away that second time, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years. Anger, not at the woman but at himself, for his assumptions, for his arrogance, for the certainty that had cost him more than he could calculate. Because she was right. Thermal mass was sound engineering. Russian stoves had been used across Europe for centuries. The principles were documented, proven effective. He'd read about them in his studies but dismissed them as old-world techniques unsuited for modern construction. And yet, here was this woman cast out by her husband's family, left to die in the Montana winter, applying knowledge that his expensive education had taught him to ignore. The log in the library fireplace collapsed in on itself, startling Morrison from his furious note-taking. Thomas paused in his narrative, taking another sip of whiskey that had gone cold. You speak of her with great respect, Morrison observed. Was she educated, trained in some European academy? Thomas laughed, but the sound carried no humor. Eleanor Ashford learned masonry from watching her father work construction sites in Yorkshire when she was a child. He was a master stonemason who wanted sons to carry on his trade, but got 4 daughters instead. Eleanor was the youngest, always underfoot at his work sites. He'd explain things to keep her busy, never thinking she'd remember. But she did. Every detail, every technique, every principle of load-bearing and thermal transfer and structural integrity. When he died and the family had nothing, and those memories became currency. Morrison scribbled notes, then looked up. And when did you see her again? December 20th, 3 weeks before Christmas. I went back a third time, and I brought my own thermometer. Thomas stood walking to the window that overlooked the dark streets of Miles City. His reflection in the glass looked older than his years. I needed proof, you understand. Either proof that Eleanor was wrong and I could dismiss her with clear conscience, or proof that I was a fool. One way or another, I had to know. The December cold had settled over Montana territory with the weight of inevitability. Temperatures dropped to 19 degrees and the old-timers were already predicting a brutal winter. Thomas rode to the limestone cliff with his thermometer tucked carefully in his saddlebag, the instrument he trusted more than his own senses. The cave dwelling had transformed in the weeks since his last visit. The interior walls were plastered smooth with clay, mixed with dried grass and a small amount of lime she'd made by burning limestone chips. The floor was hard-packed earth covered with woven grass mats. The masonry heater dominated one corner, its mass reaching nearly to the ceiling. And hanging near the entrance was another thermometer. Thomas recognized it as the same type he carried, though older and more worn. He compared readings. Outside 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Eleanor's cave, 58 degrees. Thomas checked his own thermometer 3 times, certain it must be faulty. But the mercury told the same story. The morning fire had been built hours ago, long since burned out. Yet the temperature remained stable, warm enough for comfort without any active heat source. He walked the perimeter of the space, measuring at different points. 57 degrees in the far corner, 59 near the heater, a variance of only 2 degrees across the entire dwelling. In his own cabin with its wood stove burning continuously, temperature differentials could reach 20 or 30 degrees between the fireside and the far corners. How much wood do you burn daily? Eleanor was working on storage shelves carved directly into the limestone. She answered without turning. 1 fire in the morning, burns about 2 hours, 3 fires if it's below 0 outside. Thomas did the calculations in his head. At that rate, 1 cord of wood would last her the entire winter. His own cabin consumed 1 cord every 2 weeks just to maintain tolerable temperature. The mathematics were undeniable. The physics were sound. The execution was flawless. And Thomas Hayes, Union engineer, builder of fortifications, expert in frontier construction, had to face a truth that burned worse than any winter cold. This woman with a pickaxe and childhood memories had accomplished something beyond his capabilities. I went home, Thomas told Morrison, turning from the window. And I drank whiskey, a great deal of whiskey, because I had to confront the reality that 25 years of engineering experience couldn't match the childhood recollections of a Polish immigrant. Morrison's pencil paused. That must have been difficult for a man of your accomplishments. Difficult. Thomas returned to his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. It was devastating, because it meant examining every assumption I'd built my life upon, every building I'd designed, every choice I'd made. He stared into his glass, seeing not whiskey, but the past. Catherine died in a cabin I built with my own hands, a cabin I was certain represented the pinnacle of frontier construction. Double walls, good foundation, proper chimney draw, everything I'd learned in my training and experience. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. And seeing Eleanor's cave dwelling forced me to ask the question I'd been avoiding for 2 years. What if my arrogance killed my wife? What if there were techniques, knowledge methods I'd dismissed as primitive or irrelevant? What if Catherine died not because of bad luck or God's will, but because I was too proud to learn from sources I deemed inferior? The library fell silent except for the fire's whisper. Morrison seemed to sense he'd stumbled into territory deeper than engineering principles. Finally, Thomas spoke again. That's what Eleanor taught me with her cave. Not just about thermal mass or masonry heaters, but about the cost of certainty, about the danger of assuming your education makes you wise rather than merely informed. When did you see her next? Thomas's expression softened slightly, the harsh lines around his mouth easing into something almost resembling a smile. New Year's Day, 1874. I went back one final time, but not to judge or question or prove anything. I went to surrender. The morning of January 1st arrived clear and brutally cold, 8 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that killed quickly and without mercy. Thomas rode to Eleanor's cave with a proposition that had taken him 2 weeks to formulate and longer still to accept. He found her outside the entrance, working on a series of low stone walls arranged in a stepped pattern below the dwelling. Drainage channels, he realized. She was creating a system to divert snowmelt away from the cave entrance. It showed forethought he hadn't expected, planning for spring, while winter's worst was yet to come. Mrs. Brennan, he called out, using the name she'd been cast out under, though he'd learned her maiden name was Ashford. Eleanor preferred it, but convention demanded the married name. She looked up, surprise flickering across her features. In the weeks since they'd last spoken, word had spread through the valley. The outcast woman wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. And that made her dangerous to men who needed women to fail in order to prove their own necessity. Thomas dismounted, removed his hat, and did something he couldn't remember doing in his adult life. He admitted he was wrong. Mrs. Brennan, I was wrong about the cave, wrong about thermal mass, wrong about all of it, and I'm not too proud to admit when a woman knows more than I do. Eleanor set down her shovel, studying him with those direct eyes that seemed to see past whatever mask he thought he wore. What do you want, Mr. Hayes? There are 5 families up in Wolf Creek Canyon. They settled late season, got their cabins built, but didn't think through the heating. They're burning furniture to stay warm. I'm thinking if we modified their structures with some of your techniques, added thermal mass, somehow we might save them. Thomas met her gaze without flinching. I know how to build. You know how to build correctly. I have credibility with men who won't listen to a woman. You have knowledge that could save their lives, partnership. Eleanor crossed her arms, and Thomas saw the wariness in her posture. She'd been burned before by men offering help. I don't work for charity, Mr. Hayes. I'm a builder, and I work for pay. Cash or trade goods, your choice. Something shifted in Thomas's chest. Relief, perhaps, or recognition that he was finally dealing with someone as a professional rather than a charity case. Fair enough. I'll make sure you're compensated properly. They shook hands. Her grip was firm, callous, the hand of someone who'd earned every skill through labor rather than lecture. One condition, Eleanor added. I'm not a consultant. I'm a builder. Call me that. Agreed. As Thomas rode away from the limestone cliff that day, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before Catherine died. Not happiness exactly, but purpose that extended beyond his own guilt and grief. A sense that perhaps knowledge could be shared rather than hoarded, that maybe wisdom had less to do with credentials than with willingness to learn. The library fire had burned down to coals. Morrison flexed his writing hand cramped from extensive notes. Outside, full dark had fallen over Miles City. That's where you and Mrs. Ashford became partners then, Morrison asked. Thomas poured the last of the whiskey, dividing it between their glasses. Partners, then friends, then the person I trusted more than anyone in the world. But before I learned that lesson completely, I had to watch her face an enemy worse than winter cold. What enemy? Thomas's expression hardened, the brief softness vanishing. Men like I used to be. Men who couldn't accept that a woman might be more intelligent than they were. Men whose pride mattered more than other people's lives. He took a long swallow of whiskey, and the worst of them was Eleanor's own husband, John Brennan, the man whose family cast her out, then came back to claim everything she'd built. Morrison leaned forward, pencil poised. When did he appear? Late January 1874. Just when Eleanor's reputation was spreading, when she'd started to build something beyond mere survival. That's when he showed up like a vulture spotting wounded prey. Thomas stood walking to his desk where a leather-bound ledger lay closed. He picked it up but didn't open it. This part of the story, Mr. Morrison, this is where I learned that physical courage and moral courage are entirely different things, and I was found wanting in the latter. The young reporter waited, sensing the weight of what was coming. But that, Thomas said, setting the ledger back down, that's a story for tomorrow. You'll want to rest, get your notes in order. This next part requires a clear head because it involves watching good people do nothing while evil men tried to destroy someone for the crime of being competent. He walked Morrison to the door, the young man gathering his coat and satchel. Mr. Hayes, Morrison said as he prepared to leave, why are you telling me this story if it reflects poorly on you? Thomas looked at him with those weathered eyes that had seen too much and learned too late. Because you came here to write about a great engineer, and you should, but not me. Eleanor Ashford was the great engineer. I was just the fool who finally learned to listen. He closed the door behind Morrison, returning to his chair by the dying fire. From his pocket, he withdrew a small photograph, edges worn from years of handling. Eleanor Ashford, at perhaps 40, standing in front of her cave dwelling, direct gaze meeting the camera without apology or pretense. I should have told you sooner, he whispered to the image. Should have been braver when it mattered. But I learned, Eleanor. Eventually I learned. The fire whispered its agreement, and Thomas sat alone with his memories, waiting for morning to continue a confession, 25 years delayed. Morning light filtered through the library windows, pale and cold as January ice. Thomas Hayes stood at the frosted glass, watching Miles City wake to another winter day. Behind him, Daniel Morrison settled into the same chair he'd occupied the previous evening, notebook open to a fresh page, fingers already cramped from yesterday's extensive writing. The young reporter had barely slept. The story Thomas began unfolding was nothing like the heroic engineering narrative he'd expected. It was rawer, more honest, more troubling, and infinitely more compelling. Thomas turned from the window, and Morrison noticed the older man looked even more tired than he had the night before, as if the telling of this tale extracted some physical toll. You look troubled, Mr. Morrison. I spent half the night reading my notes, Morrison admitted, trying to understand how a woman accomplished what you describe and why her name appears in no engineering journals, no territorial records, no historical accounts I could find. Thomas smiled without warmth, because history is written by men who believe they built the West, and men don't like acknowledging that sometimes the most important builders wore dresses and worked without permission or recognition. He moved to the fireplace, stirring last night's ashes and adding fresh wood. The kindling caught quickly, flames licking upward with hungry determination. When I left you yesterday, I just agreed to partner with Eleanor, January of 1874. I thought the hard part was over. I thought admitting my ignorance and learning from her would be the great challenge. Thomas settled into his chair with a sigh that seemed to carry decades of weight. I was wrong. The hard part was what came next. Because knowledge that threatens the established order doesn't go unchallenged. And Eleanor's success threatened every assumption men in that valley held about their own superiority. Morrison's pencil hovered. The persecution you mentioned last night. When did it begin? It began, Thomas said slowly, the moment Eleanor stopped being a curiosity and became a competitor. The partnership between Thomas and Eleanor proved immediately effective in ways that surprised even Thomas himself. They developed a system that played to both their strengths. Thomas handled the structural carpentry and preliminary measurements. Eleanor designed and supervised the masonry heater construction, her hands shaping clay and stone with the precision of a surgeon. The 5 families in Wolf Creek Canyon were desperate enough to accept help from any source. Their cabins hastily built before winter leaked heat like sieves. Interior temperatures hovered around 45 degrees even with fires burning continuously. They were burning furniture floorboards, anything combustible to survive. Thomas watched Eleanor work with a mix of admiration and continued humility. She didn't waste time on social niceties or gentle instruction. She simply demonstrated what needed to be done and explained the physics behind it in clear, unadorned language, and expected people to follow her guidance. The firebox needs to be precisely this dimension, she would say, holding her hands 18 inches apart. Not because I say so, but because the draft calculations require this volume for a complete combustion at this altitude. Smaller and you get incomplete burn and creosote buildup. Larger and you lose the heat concentration needed to warm the thermal mass effectively. Most of the men listened, though Thomas could see the resistance in their postures. They would glance at him for confirmation, as if Eleanor's words needed masculine validation before becoming truth. One particular incident stood out in Thomas's memory with painful clarity. Jacob Morrison, a 60-year-old farmer from Pennsylvania, argued with Eleanor about chimney height. He'd been building structures for 40 years, he insisted, and knew exactly how tall a chimney needed to be. Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She simply stated facts. Then you've been building incorrectly for 40 years. If you want proper draft, you need 3 additional feet of height or reduce the diameter by 2 inches. Choose. Jacob's face flushed red. Who do you think you are to tell me? Thomas had stepped in, then hating himself even as he did it. Jacob listened to her. I've measured the draft coefficient. Mrs. Brennan is correct. And Jacob had listened. Not to Eleanor's expertise, but to Thomas's endorsement of it. That was the pattern throughout January, Thomas told Morrison, his voice heavy with old shame. I became a translator, converting Eleanor's knowledge into something men would accept. The same word, the same information, but somehow legitimate when spoken by me rather than her. Did Mrs. Ashford resent this? Thomas considered the question. Eleanor was too practical to waste energy on resentment. She understood the game and played it, using me as a tool, just as she used her pickaxe and thermometer. But I resented it, resented my own necessity in that role, resented that truth required masculine validation. By the end of January, the results spoke louder than any words. The 5 Wolf Creek families saw their fuel consumption drop by 65%. Interior temperatures stabilized in the comfortable range. Children stopped shivering through the night. And word spread through the valley like wildfire in dry grass. 11 consultation requests arrived for Eleanor within 2 weeks. She accepted them all, charging modest fees. $15 cash from one family, a milk cow from another, tools, firewood, cloth, goods. She negotiated with the calm assurance of someone who understood her own value. Thomas watched her coin purse grow from $47 to $73, watched her acquire assets, watched her build something beyond mere survival into actual prosperity, and watched the resentment build among certain men who couldn't tolerate a woman succeeding where they struggled. The anonymous note appeared on her cave entrance in early February, Thomas said. I wasn't there when she found it, but she told me about it later. Morrison looked up from his notes. What did it say, my dear man? Unnatural woman, God will punish you. She burned it without comment, but we both knew what it meant. Her success wasn't just challenging social conventions. It was threatening men's sense of their own necessity. Thomas stood pacing to the window again, unable to remain still as the memory unfolded. That's when John Brennan appeared. The day Thomas met John Brennan, he understood immediately why Eleanor had chosen to live in a cave rather than remain married to that man. It was late January, temperature hovering near zero. Thomas and Eleanor were at the cave dwelling reviewing blueprints for the next consultation of the project. They developed an easy working relationship, professional and focused, though Thomas was becoming increasingly aware of feelings that extended beyond mere collegial respect. The sound of hoofbeats announced a visitor. Thomas looked up to see a man dismounting from a horse too expensive for practical frontier work. The rider wore a coat better suited for city streets than Montana wilderness. His face carried the weak-chinned softness of someone who'd never done hard physical labor. "Eleanor," the man called out, his voice carrying presumed authority. "Mother is gravely ill. She needs you to come home and care for her." Eleanor didn't stop working on the blueprints. Her voice remained level and motionless. "Your mother has 3 other daughters-in-law. But you're my wife. Your obligation is to—" "My obligation ended when your family cast me out in the middle of winter." Thomas observed the interaction with growing understanding. This was John Brennan, the husband who'd allowed his family to condemn Eleanor to probable death, who'd said nothing in her defense, who'd chosen his mother's approval over his wife's survival. John's eyes scanned the cave interior, and Thomas saw the calculation happening. The tools, the supplies, the milk cow tethered outside, the evidence of Eleanor's prosperity. "Eleanor," John said, his tone shifting to something meant to sound conciliatory, "what you're doing here, this isn't how a decent wife should live." "I'm not your wife anymore, John. You and your family made that clear. Legally, you're still my wife, and what you earn by law belongs to me." The words hung in the cold air like a threat taking physical form. Thomas felt something hot and violent move through his chest. He stood moving between John and Eleanor before conscious thought could catch up with instinct. "Mr. Brennan, I think you should leave." John looked at him with contempt that came easy to men of his type. "And who are you, Bushon?" "Thomas Hayes. I work with Mrs. Brennan, and I believe this conversation is finished." John's expression twisted into something ugly. "Work with her or work her, is that what this is? The poor barren woman takes up with another man before the marriage is even—" Thomas hit him. One clean punch to the jaw that sent John staggering backward. It was exactly what John wanted. "That's assault," John said, blood trickling from his split lip, his smile triumphant. "Witnessed. I can have you arrested, Hayes. Could cost you your land." Eleanor's hand on Thomas's arm stopped him from advancing further. "Let him go," she said quietly. "He wants this. Don't give him what he wants." John mounted his horse, still smiling through the blood. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer, Eleanor, and from the territorial judge, about my legal rights to your earnings, and about the adultery you're clearly committing." He rode away, leaving Thomas shaking with rage and Eleanor unnaturally calm. "I'm sorry," Thomas said. "I shouldn't have." "No, you shouldn't have. But I understand why you did." Eleanor returned to her blueprints as if nothing had happened. "He'll make trouble now. Legal trouble. Be prepared." Thomas sat heavily on the stone bench Eleanor had carved into the cave wall. "Can he actually claim your earnings?" "Legally, perhaps. Territorial law is unclear about women's property rights when they're estranged but not divorced. John knows that. He'll exploit the ambiguity." "And the adultery accusation?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "If that succeeds, I lose all credibility. No one will hire a woman considered fallen. Everything I've built disappears." Thomas felt the trap closing. "I could marry you, legally protect you that way." "No," Eleanor's voice was sharp. "I didn't escape one man's ownership to accept another's, even with good intentions. I'll fight John Brennan with truth, not by trading one master for another." Morrison interrupted Thomas's narrative. "Did Brennan follow through with his threats?" 3 days later, he filed claims with the territorial judge, one claiming Eleanor's earnings as his legal husband, another claiming we were living in adultery, citing that he'd found us alone together in the cave. Thomas returned to his chair, the telling of this part clearly painful. "I was terrified, not for myself but for Eleanor. If John won his claim, he'd take everything she'd earned. And if the adultery accusation stuck, she'd be ruined socially. No one would hire her. Everything she'd accomplished would be destroyed." "What did you do?" "I did what I should have done from the beginning. I went to Reverend Sullivan." The Irish priest had been riding circuit through Montana territory for 15 years. James Sullivan was weathered as driftwood, with eyes that had seen too much human suffering to judge hastily but too much human wickedness to trust blindly. Thomas found him at the small church 11 miles south of the valley, preparing for Sunday service. "Thomas Hayes," Sullivan greeted him. "You look troubled." "I need your help, Reverend, or rather Eleanor Ashford needs it." Sullivan gestured to a pew and they sat in the cold church breath, misting in the unheated air. Thomas explained the situation, John's claims, the legal threats, the adultery accusation that could destroy Eleanor's livelihood. "What do you want from me?" Sullivan asked when Thomas finished. "A sermon about bearing false witness, about the sin of maligning innocent people." Sullivan studied him with those two perceptive eyes. "You want me to use my pulpit to protect Mrs. Brennan. I want you to use it to protect truth." The priest was silent for a long moment. "I'll do it. But first you need to answer one question honestly, Thomas. Are you doing this because it's right or because you're in love with Eleanor Ashford?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to deny it, then found he couldn't speak the lie. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I only know that letting her be harmed for helping people, for being competent, for threatening men's pride with her skill, that's wrong. And I've been silent too many times in my life when I should have spoken." Sullivan nodded slowly. "Then I'll speak, this Sunday. But Thomas, understand that speaking in her defense might not be enough. Men like John Brennan don't surrender easily." The old priest was right. John didn't work alone. Thomas discovered this through Elias Whitfield, the Shoshone guide, who moved between both the white and native communities with the ease of someone belonging fully to neither. Elias appeared at Thomas's farm on a cold February morning. "You should know," Elias said without preamble. "John Brennan has found an ally, Daniel Hartwell." The name struck Thomas cold. Daniel Hartwell owned 180 acres of prime bottomland. His wife Rebecca was from Connecticut, educated, refined, and had very specific ideas about how civilized people should live. They had 3 children in a proper 2-story house with glass windows. Why would Hartwell involve himself? Elias's expression suggested the answer should be obvious. Because his wife won't stop talking about Eleanor. Because his daughter Emma spends every free moment learning from Eleanor instead of practicing piano and embroidery. Because Eleanor makes more money than he does, and that makes him feel small. Thomas felt sick. What are they planning? Rumor campaign. They're spreading word that masonry heaters cause carbon monoxide poisoning. They've found a family willing to claim they got sick after installing one. They're going to ruin her reputation, then John's legal claim becomes easier to win. Thomas stood there in his yard, frozen by more than winter cold. This was beyond legal maneuvering. This was deliberate destruction of someone whose only crime was competence that threatened masculine pride. "I need to tell Eleanor." "She already knows," Elias said. "I told her first. She's preparing a defense." "What kind of defense?" "The kind Eleanor always uses. Facts, proof. She's organizing a public demonstration." The public hearing was scheduled for February 1st in the Territorial Office Building. Half the valley attended, drawn by gossip and the promise of scandal. John Brennan opened with accusations carefully designed to undermine Eleanor's credibility without engaging her knowledge. She was unqualified, he claimed, self-taught from childhood memories with no formal training. Her techniques were dangerous, as evidenced by the family suffering from suspected carbon monoxide poisoning. She'd bewitched men like Thomas Hayes into supporting her through means no decent woman would employ. Daniel Hartwell testified next, claiming his family had experienced headaches and nausea from fumes from the masonry heater Eleanor had supervised in their home. Thomas sat in the audience, fists clenched, watching this coordinated assault on someone whose only weapon was truth. When his turn came to speak, he stood with documentation he'd spent weeks preparing. Temperature logs from 11 homesteads, fuel consumption calculations, testimonials from satisfied families, scientific papers on thermal mass principles. "Thermal mass isn't Mrs. Brennan's invention," Thomas said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "It's physics. The same principle used in industrial cold storage. I designed it for the Union Army during the war. Stone absorbs and releases heat at predictable rates. This isn't magic or witchcraft. It's thermodynamics." He watched faces in the audience, trying to gauge reaction. "As for the claim of carbon monoxide poisoning," Thomas continued, "Mr. Hartwell's symptoms appeared the same week he and John Brennan were seen together at the saloon multiple times. I've inspected his heater personally. The draft is perfect. The combustion complete. If he's experiencing symptoms, they're either fabricated or from some other source. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eleanor spoke last. She didn't argue credentials or defend her gender. She simply stated facts. I started with $47. I now have $73, a milk cow, and a roof above my head that I built with my own hands. If my techniques didn't work, I would have frozen to death in December. But I'm standing here. Meanwhile, Mr. Hartwell, with his expensive house, was burning furniture to survive before I taught him better methods. The truth landed like a hammer blow. Several people in the audience nodded, remembering exactly that detail about the Hartwell household. We can argue all day, Eleanor continued, or we can prove this with science. I propose a demonstration, two identical small structures, one heated with a traditional wood stove, one with a small masonry heater. Same amount of wood. We measure temperatures over 24 hours. Science doesn't lie, even if men do. The territorial judge, a practical man named Harrison, agreed immediately. The hearing was postponed 1 week for the demonstration to be built and tested. Thomas and Eleanor spent the next 7 days constructing two identical 12 by 12-foot structures on public land near the territorial office. Same materials, same insulation, same orientation. The only difference was the heating method. They worked mostly in silence, the focused quiet of people who'd developed unspoken communication through shared labor. But one evening, as they sat by firelight in Eleanor's cave reviewing the next day's construction plan, Eleanor asked the question Thomas had been dreading. Why are you doing this, Thomas? He looked up from the blueprints. Because I want to prove them wrong. That's not the truth. You could stay out of this entirely. Let me fight my own battles. Why aren't you? Thomas stared into the flames, watching heat rise invisible into the cold air. Because when Catherine died, I blamed myself. I thought if I'd built a better house, if I'd been a better engineer, she would have lived. And then you appeared with knowledge I didn't have, accomplishing what I thought impossible. And I realized I didn't fail Catherine because I lacked skill. I failed her because of arrogance, because I thought I knew everything. If I'd been willing to learn to listen, to admit ignorance, and seek knowledge from any source regardless of whether that source had formal credentials. His voice broke. Eleanor waited. I can't save Catherine, but maybe I can help save others by standing beside someone who knows more than I do, by learning instead of assuming, by defending truth instead of pride. Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Then she placed her hand over his, a brief touch that communicated more than words. Thank you for being honest. They returned to work, and Thomas felt something shift between them. Not romance exactly, something deeper. The recognition of two people who'd both lost too much and were determined not to lose anything else to pride or silence. The night before the demonstration, Thomas discovered Daniel Hartwell attempting to sabotage the masonry heater structure. He'd climbed onto the roof and was trying to block the chimney with rags. Thomas approached quietly, Elias Whitfield behind him with a rifle not quite pointed, but definitely present. Step down from there, Daniel. Hartwell spun, nearly losing his balance. Hayes, I'm just checking the construction. At midnight, with materials designed to block airflow. Step down now. Daniel climbed down, his face flushed with shame and defiance. You don't understand, he said, desperation making his voice rise. If women can do men's work, what are we? If she's smarter than us, what value do we have? Thomas felt pity mixed with disgust. We have the value of what we learn, Daniel, not what we pretend to know. Eleanor doesn't make you worthless. Your pride does that all by itself. Elias stepped forward. I saw everything. Try anything tomorrow, and I'll testify about tonight. Daniel left, shoulders hunched in defeat. The demonstration began at dawn on February 1st. The territorial judge supervised, personally ensuring fairness. Each structure received the exact same amount of wood, carefully weighed. The traditional stove in Structure A was lit at 6 a.m. The masonry heater in Structure B received its fire at the same moment. By 8 a.m., Structure A was warm, 72 degrees. Structure B was only at 60 degrees. Thomas saw John Brennan smile, thinking he'd won. But by noon, both structures registered the same temperature, 68 degrees. The difference appeared when the fires burned out. Structure A's fire lasted 8 hours, consuming all its wood by 2 p.m. By 6 p.m., the temperature had dropped to 45 degrees. By midnight, 32 degrees. By the next morning, 28 degrees. Structure B's fire burned for only 2 hours, going out by 8 a.m. But the temperature didn't drop. The massive heater continued radiating warmth: 65 degrees at noon, 62 degrees at midnight, 58 degrees at dawn the next day. The mathematics were irrefutable. Structure A had burned all its fuel and now offered no warmth. Structure B maintained comfortable temperature 24 hours after the fire died. The crowd that gathered to witness the final measurements saw the truth written in mercury and stone. John Brennan left without a word. Daniel Hartwell stood staring at the structures, his entire worldview crumbling. The territorial judge ruled in Eleanor's favor on all counts. John's claim to her earnings was dismissed. The adultery accusation was deemed baseless slander. But Thomas knew the victory was incomplete, because he'd watched Eleanor stand alone defending herself while he provided supporting evidence, because he'd seen the toll the fight extracted, because truth had prevailed, but only after a battle that never should have been necessary. Morrison set down his pencil, flexing cramped fingers. She won then. The persecution ended. Thomas shook his head slowly. She won that battle. But men like John don't surrender. And the real test was yet to come. Because 3 weeks later, nature decided to settle all arguments about whose methods worked and whose pride mattered. The blizzard was coming, the worst storm of the century, and only one structure in the entire valley would prove safe enough to survive it. He stood stretching stiff joints. That's enough for today. Rest your hand, Mr. Morrison. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the 63 hours that changed everything. About watching people I cared about trapped in a storm that killed 19 others. About learning that sometimes the only difference between life and death is whether you were humble enough to accept help from someone you'd previously scorned. Morrison gathered his materials but paused at the door. Mr. Hayes, one question. When did you realize you loved her? Thomas looked at the young reporter with eyes that had seen too much. I realized it during those 63 hours trapped in my cabin, burning wood constantly just to maintain 40 degrees, terrified that Eleanor might die, and I'd never told her the truth. But that's tomorrow's story, and it ends with a confession I was 25 years too late in making. He closed the door, returning to his chair and the photograph he kept in his pocket. Eleanor at 40, standing before the cave that saved lives and proved everything Thomas thought he knew about building, was incomplete. I should have been braver, he whispered to the image. Should have stood beside you from the beginning instead of learning humility through your suffering. But Eleanor couldn't hear him. She'd been dead for over a year, buried in the small cemetery outside Miles City, her gravestone reading simply, Eleanor Ashford Builder, with dates that told nothing of the revolution she'd quietly created. Thomas sat alone with his regrets and his memories, waiting for morning to continue a story that still hurt to tell. Dawn broke over Miles City with the pale, reluctant light of deep winter. Thomas Hayes had been awake for hours, sitting in his library chair, watching darkness gradually surrender to gray. He'd barely slept, haunted by memories that 25 years had failed to diminish. When Daniel Morrison arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, notebook in hand, he found the older man already dressed, fire-blazing coffee prepared. Thomas looked haggard but determined, as if he'd spent the night marshaling courage for what needed to be said. You look like you've been to war, Morrison observed, accepting the offered coffee. I have been, Thomas replied. Every night I relive it. February 14th, 1874. St. Valentine's Day. Though there was nothing romantic about what happened. Just 63 hours of terror and a lesson in humility written in frozen blood. He settled into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints remembered cold that went bone deep. I left you yesterday with the demonstration's success. Eleanor vindicated John Brennan's claims, dismissed Daniel Hartwell, exposed as a saboteur and liar. We thought the worst was over. Morrison opened his notebook to a fresh page. But it wasn't. No, because nature doesn't care about human conflicts or legal victories or wounded pride. Nature simply is. And when it decides to remind you of your insignificance, all your certainties become irrelevant. Thomas stared into the fire, seeing not flames but snow. Endless, murderous snow. The warning signs appeared 2 days after the demonstration. February 13th, the temperature, which had been brutally cold, suddenly warmed. 45 degrees by midday, unseasonably mild. The old-timers knew what that meant. Storm coming, big one. He paused, taking a sip of coffee that had already gone cold. An elderly Shoshone woman came to the valley that afternoon with Elias Whitfield. I was at Eleanor's cave when they arrived. The woman spoke no English, but Elias translated. She said the same thing in 3 different ways, making sure we understood. Big snow coming, bigger than any white people had seen in this territory. When the birds go silent, maybe 10 days, maybe less. Morrison scribbled notes. Did you believe her? Eleanor did, immediately. She started stocking extra firewood, water, food. I asked if I should stay to help, but she refused. Told me to secure my own farm, that the storm would test every structure in the valley. Thomas's expression darkened. I should have insisted on staying, should have trusted my instinct instead of her independence. But I rode home like she asked and spent February 13th reinforcing my cabin, stacking firewood, preparing for a storm that my education and experience told me would be severe but survivable. He laughed, but the sound held no humor. Survivable. That word means something different when you're sitting in a properly built cabin with double walls and a good foundation. It means something else entirely when you're 5 miles from home in a wagon with injured man and 3 children, and visibility drops to 0 in the span of heartbeats. Morrison looked up from his notes. The Hartwell family. The Hartwell family, Daniel, Rebecca, Emma, who was 13, Matthew, who was 7, Samuel, who was 5. They had gone to the trading post that morning, February 14th, Valentine's Day. The storm wasn't supposed to hit for another week. Thomas stood unable to remain seated as the memory seized him. Weather doesn't follow predictions. That afternoon at 2 o'clock, the temperature dropped 30 degrees in less than an hour. The wind rose from nothing to 60 miles per hour in minutes. Snow began falling at 3 inches per hour. And the Hartwell family was 5 miles from home with no shelter in sight. He walked to the window, though the view showed only present-day Miles City, not the terror of that long-ago storm. I wasn't there when it happened. I only know from Rebecca's account told to me weeks later when she could finally speak of it without breaking. Daniel was driving the wagon. They were on the trail home thinking they had plenty of time. Then the world went white. Thomas's voice dropped lower, taking on the cadence of someone recounting a story told by another but absorbed into his own memory through repetition and imagination. Daniel couldn't see the horses, couldn't see 5 feet ahead. The temperature plunged to -20 and kept falling. The horses panicked. One broke through creek ice they didn't know they were crossing. The animal thrashed, the wagon lurched, and Daniel was thrown clear. Landed hard, cracked 3 ribs, possibly broke his collarbone. Started coughing blood. Morrison's pencil moved rapidly across the page. Rebecca managed to free the horse, get Daniel back into the wagon. But they were lost. Completely, utterly lost. Couldn't see landmarks, couldn't see the trail. The children were already shivering despite their winter clothes. Daniel was semi-conscious, each breath bringing pain and more blood. Thomas turned from the window. That's when Emma Hartwell remembered. The 13-year-old girl who'd been forbidden by her mother from visiting Eleanor. The girl who'd sketched the cave design in her school notebook. She remembered that Eleanor's dwelling sat less than 2 miles northeast of where they were. If they could find Rosebud Creek and follow it upstream... Brilliant, Morrison breathed. Desperate, but yes, brilliant. Rebecca's first instinct was to refuse. Pride and prejudice run deep even when death is the alternative. But Daniel, half-conscious and in agony, managed 2 words. Listen, girl. Thomas returned to his chair, the telling of this part seeming to drain something from him. So they followed Emma's directions, through whiteout conditions, through cold that was already approaching -30. Rebecca driving blind, Emma navigating by memory and instinct, the younger boys huddled with their injured father. All of them knowing they had perhaps 1 hour before hypothermia became fatal. He paused and Morrison waited, sensing the weight of what came next. Meanwhile, I was trapped at my farm. I'd tried to ride out when the storm hit, thinking to check on Eleanor. My horse refused to move. Visibility was 0. The wind would have killed me before I made it 100 yards. So I sat in my cabin, burning wood at a rate I knew was unsustainable, trying to maintain 40 degrees interior temperature, and I thought about Eleanor. Thomas's voice cracked slightly. For 63 hours, I sat there in that cabin I'd built with such pride, and I performed calculations. If Eleanor had enough wood, if the cave's thermal mass would hold in extreme cold, if there were factors I'd missed in my analysis. And for the first time in my adult life, I prayed. Not to God necessarily, but to physics, to thermodynamics, to the fundamental laws I'd built my career understanding. I prayed that I'd been right about thermal mass, that Eleanor's cave would prove what I'd claimed it would prove. Morrison leaned forward. You were in love with her. I was terrified, Thomas corrected. Love came later, or maybe had been there all along and I was too proud to name it. But in that moment, trapped and helpless, I had to confront the possibility that Eleanor might die, and I would never have the chance to tell her she taught me more than any professor or textbook ever had. That watching her work had been the greatest education of my life. That I respected her more than anyone I'd ever known. He took a long breath. But I didn't know then that she wasn't alone. I thought she was weathering the storm by herself, safe in her cave but solitary. I didn't know that at approximately 4 o'clock on February 14th, the Hartwell family found the limestone cliff through the snow. Didn't know that Rebecca Hartwell, who'd called Eleanor's dwelling madness and predicted Eleanor would freeze to death, was pounding on the Buffalo High door, begging for sanctuary. Thomas smiled slightly, the first genuine smile Morrison had seen from him. Eleanor told me later what she thought when she heard that pounding. She thought it was wind or debris. Then she heard Rebecca's voice screaming for help, and Eleanor opened that door without hesitation. Morrison's hand moved across the page, capturing every word. 5 people stumbled into that cave. Daniel semi-conscious and coughing blood. Rebecca on the verge of collapse from exhaustion and fear. Emma hypothermic but conscious. The 2 boys, Matthew and Samuel, shaking so violently they could barely stand. All of them convinced they were minutes from death. Thomas leaned back, eyes distant with vicarious memory. Eleanor assessed the situation in seconds, pulled them inside, barred the door against the wind, fired the masonry heater immediately with a larger load of wood than she'd normally use. Then she went to work with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that panic kills as surely as cold. He ticked off points on his fingers. First the children, strip wet clothes, wrap in dry blankets near the heater, hot willow bark tea to warm internally. Second Rebecca, mild hypothermia but conscious, same treatment. Monitor for worsening symptoms. Third Daniel, severe trauma, broken ribs, possible punctured lung, internal bleeding. Eleanor bound his ribs with cloth strips torn from her own spare clothing. Positioned him near the heater where warmth concentrated. More willow bark tea for pain and inflammation. Then the hardest part, waiting to see if he'd survive the night. Morrison interrupted. She saved them all. She saved them all, in a space built for 1 person now housing 6. But that cave's design exceeded even my calculations. The 288-square-foot space felt crowded, but not impossibly so. The masonry heater fired twice during that first night radiated enough warmth to begin stabilizing everyone's core temperature within 20 minutes. Thomas stood again, pacing with the restless energy of someone whose body remembered being trapped. Outside, the temperature dropped to minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chills probably reached minus 70 or worse. The kind of cold that kills in minutes. That turns breath to ice crystals before it leaves your lungs. Inside that cave, the temperature never dropped below 62 degrees. He let that sink in. 62 degrees, stable, maintained by thermal mass and a design everyone had called primitive. While I sat in my modern cabin with continuous fire barely maintaining 40 degrees and burning through a week's worth of wood every day, Eleanor's cave kept 6 people comfortable with 2 fires per day. Morrison shook his head in wonder. And the storm lasted how long? 63 hours, from 2 p.m. on February 14th until 5 a.m. on February 17th. 63 hours of the worst blizzard conditions Montana Territory had ever seen. 19 people died in that storm within 30 miles of where we sat. 19 people in cabins and homesteads that were supposed to be adequate shelter. They froze to death while the Hartwell family survived in a cave built by a woman they tried to destroy. Thomas returned to his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 67 years. Eleanor told me later about those 63 hours, how the first night was silent except for Daniel's labored breathing and the wind's shriek, how Rebecca finally spoke on the second day when Daniel's condition had stabilized enough to allow conversation. He closed his eyes, reciting words Eleanor had shared with him in confidence, words that still resonated across the decades. Rebecca said, I owe you an apology. More than one. And Eleanor replied, you owe me nothing. This is what people do. They help each other survive. But Rebecca wouldn't let it go. She said, no. What people should do, I didn't. Thomas opened his eyes and Morrison saw tears gathering there. Rebecca confessed everything. That she'd been jealous of Eleanor's freedom. That she'd been educated at the finest girls' academy in Connecticut, taught piano and embroidery, and French literature, all the skills to be a proper wife, and every single one was useless on the frontier. While Eleanor, with dirty hands and no formal education, could do what no one else could do, could build and survive and prosper through knowledge rather than credentials. He wiped at his eyes without shame. Rebecca said she'd seen Eleanor as threatening the social order that kept her safe. But that safety was a cage. And watching Eleanor work, watching her save Daniel's life with willow bark and cloth bindings, and knowledge passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, Rebecca realized that she'd spent her entire life conforming to expectations that served men's comfort rather than women's potential. Morrison wrote furiously, sensing he was capturing something more than historical record. Eleanor's response was simple. She said, I didn't choose freedom, Rebecca. I chose survival. Freedom was the side effect. And then she told Rebecca to learn, to take what Eleanor taught and pass it to Emma, to give her daughter choices Rebecca never had. Thomas stood once more, unable to remain still. While this was happening, while Eleanor was transforming the woman who'd tried to ruin her, while the Hartwell children were safe and warm in a cave everyone had mocked, I was going through my own hell. Because I didn't know any of this. I sat in my cabin for 63 hours thinking Eleanor was alone, thinking she might be dying, thinking I'd never have the chance to tell her what she meant to me. His voice roughened. I kept my cabin at 40 degrees by burning wood continuously. One cord every 5 days, unsustainable rate. My hands were raw from splitting logs. My eyes burned from smoke. And I performed calculations obsessively. If Eleanor's cave maintained the 58 degrees I'd measured before the storm, she'd be fine. But what if extreme cold changed the equation? What if there were variables I'd missed? What if my arrogant certainty about thermal mass was wrong, and Eleanor paid the price for my ignorance? Morrison looked up. You thought she might die. I was certain she would die, certain that my educated guesses and textbook knowledge would prove inadequate against nature's fury. Certain that I'd failed another woman through pride disguised as expertise. Thomas moved to the window again, looking out at the morning light. When the storm finally broke on the morning of February 17th, I couldn't saddle my horse fast enough, but the drifts were higher than my head in places. I had to dig my way out of the barn. By the time I managed to ride out, 8 other men had assembled. We'd all had the same thought. Form a rescue party, find survivors, bury the dead. He turned back to Morrison. My priority was Eleanor's cave. The others wanted to search for the Hartwell family first. They'd been reported missing before the storm hit. I argued we should check Eleanor's location because it was closest. Truth was, I didn't care about proximity. I cared about Eleanor, and I was ashamed of prioritizing one life over 5, but I couldn't help myself. Thomas returned to his chair, settling heavily. We reached the limestone cliffs 6 hours after the storm ended. Temperature had climbed to -1 degree, which felt tropical compared to the previous days. I dismounted 100 yards out, couldn't wait for the horse to navigate the drifts. I ran. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I expected to find Eleanor frozen. Expected to dig her body from the cave and spend the rest of my life knowing I'd failed to save her because I'd been too proud to insist on staying when the warnings came. Instead, he paused, overcome by memory. Instead, I found the buffalo hide door secured and intact. I heard voices inside, children's laughter. I knocked and Eleanor opened the door, alive and well, and completely unsurprised to see me. Thomas smiled through tears. Behind her, I saw Daniel resting comfortably, his color improved. Rebecca sitting with Emma, both of them talking quietly. The 2 boys playing some game with stones. The thermometer hanging near the entrance, reading 64 degrees. Outside temperature -1. Inside 64. A 65-degree differential maintained by stone and knowledge, and the humility to learn from grandmothers who'd survived harder winters in the old country. Morrison had stopped writing, caught up in the emotion of the moment. "What did you say to her?" Thomas laughed, the sound breaking with emotion. "I said you saved them. You saved them all." And Eleanor replied with that practical directness I'd come to love. "The cave saved them. I just remembered how to build it." Then she looked past me at the other 7 men standing there in the snow and said, "I assume you're here for the Hartwells. They're ready to go home whenever they're strong enough." He shook his head at the memory. No drama, no self-congratulation, just facts. The cave worked because physics works. The Hartwells survived because they'd been humble enough to accept help from someone they had scorned. And I stood there in my expensive coat, having barely survived in my modern cabin, looking at a woman who'd accomplished what I never could with a fraction of my resources and twice my wisdom. Thomas stood walking to his desk where the leather-bound ledger lay. He opened it for the first time in Morrison's presence. I turned to the other men and said exactly what I felt. "Gentlemen, I believe we've been building our houses wrong." Morrison smiled, and they listened. They had no choice. The evidence was irrefutable. Within 1 week, I had 17 consultation requests on Eleanor's behalf. Within 1 month, 4 families were excavating hillsides to create earth-sheltered structures. Eleanor's techniques spread through the valley like a gospel of survival. But the true transformation wasn't in buildings, it was in people. I watched men who dismissed Eleanor as an unnatural woman now remove their hats when she passed. Watched women who'd called her dwelling madness now ask her advice on their own homes. Watched children point to the limestone cliff and say with pride, "That's Miss Eleanor, the builder's house." The cave became a landmark. The woman became a legend. And I became someone who finally understood that the greatest structures we build aren't made of stone. They're made of knowledge that persists across generations, changing not just how people live, but how they think about who deserves respect. He ran his finger down entries in the ledger. But more importantly, the social order shifted. Rebecca Hartwell, who'd been Eleanor's most vocal critic, became her most passionate advocate. She testified before the territorial legislature that spring, arguing for building codes that required thermal mass in public structures. The codes that eventually passed incorporated her recommendations. A small victory, but a real one. Thomas turned pages, his expression softening. Morrison leaned forward, and the daughter, Emma. Thomas's expression softened completely for the first time. Emma graduated from Helena Normal School in 1878. I attended the ceremony at Eleanor's invitation. Emma was 21 by then, and her valedictory speech was titled, "On the Science of Survival." He paused, remembering. She stood before 200 people and credited Eleanor by name, explained thermal mass principles to an audience that included territorial legislators, argued that practical knowledge mattered more than decorative accomplishments. The applause lasted 5 minutes. Thomas smiled at the memory. After the ceremony, Emma approached Eleanor and me together. She said, "Thank you both. Mr. Hayes for defending Mrs. Ashford when others wouldn't. Mrs. Ashford for showing me that women can build futures, not just wait for them." Then she turned to her mother, who was weeping openly, and said, "And thank you, Mother, for being brave enough to change." He shook his head slowly. Rebecca embraced her daughter and said something I'll never forget. She said, "I gave you life, Emma, but Eleanor gave you choices. That's the greater gift." That was when I understood that Eleanor's revolution wasn't just about building techniques. It was about building possibilities for the next generation. Thomas returned to the ledger, turning more pages. Emma spent 32 years educating children about applied science and practical knowledge. In her classroom hung a detailed cross-section drawing of a masonry heater with a plaque reading, "Designed by Eleanor Ashford, who proved that wisdom has no gender." Morrison returned to writing, capturing these details. "And you, Mr. Hayes, how did those 63 hours change you?" Thomas closed the ledger carefully. "They taught me the difference between knowing and understanding. I knew about thermal mass from textbooks. Eleanor understood it from living with its principles. I knew building codes and structural engineering. She understood survival in ways my education never addressed. Those 63 hours showed me that humility isn't weakness. It's the foundation of real wisdom." He returned to his chair, looking suddenly exhausted. Eleanor and I remained close friends for the next 23 years. She never remarried. When people asked why, she'd say that independence once earned wasn't easily surrendered. I never remarried either, though my reasons were different. You loved her. Every day for 25 years. But Eleanor had chosen freedom, and I respected that choice. Sometimes loving someone means letting them live on their own terms, rather than trying to possess them. Thomas pulled the photograph from his pocket, handing it to Morrison. This was taken in 1880, Eleanor at 40 standing before the cave she donated to the mission school as a teaching site. Reverend Sullivan used it for years to demonstrate practical building techniques to immigrant students. Some of those students published guides on frontier construction, though they rarely credited a woman as their source. Morrison studied the photograph. Eleanor Ashford looked directly at the camera, no smile but a quiet confidence that radiated from the image. She died last year, March of 1897, age 73. Wealthy by frontier standards, respected by those who knew her, forgotten by official history. Her obituary ran 3 sentences and misspelled her name, called her a builder and teacher but gave no details. Thomas took the photograph back, holding it gently. I was at her bedside at the end. So was Rebecca Hartwell, 62 years old, and still fierce in Eleanor's defense. Rebecca said, "You saved my life twice. Once from the cold, once from myself." And Eleanor smiled and replied, "I just remembered what worked. That's all any of us can do." He looked at Morrison with eyes that had seen too much and understood too late. After Rebecca left the room, Eleanor turned to me. Those were her last words to me personally. She touched my hand and said, "You became a good man, Thomas. Not because you were perfect, but because you were willing to admit when you were wrong." I tried to tell her what she'd meant to me, what she'd taught me, how loving her had been the great privilege of my life, even if I'd never spoken it aloud. But she stopped me, said, "I know, I've always known, and I'm grateful you loved me enough not to try changing me." Thomas wiped his eyes. She died an hour later. We buried her in the cemetery outside town. The stone reads Eleanor Ashford Builder with her dates. Nothing about being the first woman builder in Montana Territory. Nothing about the lives she saved, or the knowledge she spread, or the revolution she quietly created in how people approached survival. Morrison closed his notebook. The cave still stands. Still functional. In 1903, some university students did thermal imaging studies. 150 years after Eleanor built it, the thermal mass still moderates temperature. Still works exactly as she said it would. Requires 54% less heating energy than comparable structures from the same era. Thomas stood moving to the fireplace. "You came here wanting to write about a great engineer, Mr. Morrison. I've given you that story. But the engineer wasn't me. It was Eleanor Ashford, immigrant woman with a pickaxe and childhood memories who proved that wisdom doesn't require credentials, who saved lives by remembering what others had forgotten, who taught everyone willing to learn that our ancestors weren't primitive. They were practical." He turned to face the young reporter. "That's the story you should write. Not about the men who built the West through conquest and engineering, but about the woman who built survival through knowledge and humility and the understanding that nature doesn't care about your pride, only about whether you're smart enough to work with it instead of against it." Morrison gathered his materials, clearly moved. "I'll write it exactly as you've told it." "They won't publish it," Thomas said quietly. "Not the real story. They'll edit out Eleanor's centrality, make me the hero, turn her into a supporting character. That's how history works when women accomplish things men can't accept. Then I'll publish it myself if I have to." Thomas smiled genuinely this time. "You're young enough to believe that matters. Good. The young should be idealistic. Just remember that Eleanor didn't need monuments or recognition. She needed people to learn, to survive, to remember that knowledge comes from everywhere if you're humble enough to accept it." After Morrison left, Thomas sat alone in his library holding Eleanor's photograph and the ledger she'd kept for 40 years. He opened to the final entry written in her careful hand the day before she died. Day 13,879. "I am not dead. I am not defeated. I built something that will outlast me. That is enough." Thomas took up a pen and added his own entry below hers. Day 13,927. "You didn't just outlast yourself, Eleanor. You taught me and hundreds of others that wisdom has many forms. That strength isn't always loud. That legacy isn't about credit, but about whether knowledge continues." I lived 25 more years after you, but the best years of my life were those spent working beside you, learning from you, loving you enough to let you be free. They'll forget your name, but in every house built with thermal mass every winter, survived with less fuel, every woman who chooses knowledge over limitation, you're still alive. That's legacy, not monuments, just warmth persisting. He closed the ledger and sat watching the fire burn down to coals, thinking about caves and courage, and the woman who'd taught him that the greatest engineering wasn't about building structures, but about building understanding. Outside, snow began to fall on Miles City, gentle and quiet. Thomas watched it accumulate and thought about another snow 25 years past that had killed 19 and saved 6. The difference between those outcomes was knowledge. The difference was humility. The difference was one woman who remembered what her grandmother taught her and had the courage to apply it when everyone said it wouldn't work. Thomas Hayes died 4 years later at age 71. His obituary mentioned engineering contributions, but not Eleanor Ashford. In the small cemetery outside Miles City, their graves lie 30 feet apart, close enough that if stones could speak, they might continue the conversation that death interrupted. Eleanor's cave stands still restored as a historical site. Thermal imaging shows that 150 years after construction, the thermal mass still functions exactly as she designed. Some knowledge doesn't need monuments. It just needs stone memory and the willingness to learn. Eleanor Ashford built her home inside a cave because she had no choice. But in doing so, she proved that limitations can become advantages, that ancient wisdom often surpasses modern arrogance, and that the best innovations are simply old solutions applied with new understanding. The blizzard came. The cave endured. Everyone inside lived. That's the only metric that matters when winter has you in its teeth and pride is a luxury you cannot afford. The lesson remains carved in limestone, proven by survival, preserved in stone, that remembers what we too often forget. Our ancestors weren't primitive. They were practical. And practical knowledge never goes out of style.